The alien border was a place of strict rules and regulations, a boundary that separated the peaceful, thriving world of the aliens from the chaos of other worlds. It was a space where authority ruled with a firm hand, and the officers who stood guard at the gates held the power to decide who could enter and who would be turned away. Among these officers was one, a serious, disciplined figure who had never shown any sign of mercy. He was known for his sharp judgment and unshakable resolve. His role was clear: protect the peace of his people and ensure that nothing threatened their world. One day, a human arrived at the border carrying with him a sense of desperation. The human was ragged and tired, as though he had been traveling for days. His face was worn from exhaustion, his clothes torn from the harsh conditions outside the alien world. He approached the border officer with a sense of urgency, his eyes pleading for entry. The officer could see that the human was no ordinary traveler. He had a certain wildness in him, something that set him apart from the peaceful visitors the officer was used to. There was a nervous energy about him, an unsettling aura that made the officer's instincts sharpen. The human's voice trembled as he explained that he was seeking refuge, that he needed help and a place to rest. The officer studied him with suspicion. The human's past was a mystery. Who was he? What had brought him here? Was he a criminal or just an innocent wanderer? The officer was taught to be wary of outsiders, especially humans. His people had long been suspicious of humans, believing them to be reckless and dangerous. They had no time for strangers who could bring trouble, and the officer had his orders: keep the peace at all costs. With a cold expression, the officer refused the human's request. He explained that the world inside the border was not a place for just anyone, that only those who were approved could enter. The human's pleas grew more desperate, but the officer remained unmoved. It wasn't that he enjoyed rejecting the human, it was just that he had seen too many hopeful faces, too many sad stories, and he had learned not to let them affect him. His duty was to protect his people, not to be swayed by emotional appeals. The human, realizing he wasn't going to get through, began to walk away. As he turned to leave, the officer felt something strange. It wasn't guilt exactly, but there was a nagging feeling that he couldn't shake off. He watched the human's figure fade into the distance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a brief moment, the officer wondered if he had made the right decision. After all, the human didn't seem dangerous, just desperate. But he had been trained to trust his instincts and follow orders. In his mind, the decision was clear. The world inside the border was for his people, not for strangers. As the officer returned to his post, he tried to push the feeling aside. He told himself that he had done the right thing. The rules were there, for a reason. Still, something gnawed at him. He couldn't understand why he couldn't let go of the image of the human walking away. Why had the human seemed so different? Why did he feel as though the officer had just let something important slip through his fingers? The day passed slowly, with the officer continuing his patrol, but the nagging feeling lingered. It was rare for him to feel uncertainty. He had always been sure of his decisions, always confident in his ability to uphold the law. But this time the doubts refused to go away. It was as if he had been tested, and he hadn't passed. He had denied the human, but something inside him questioned whether that was truly the right choice. And then, just as the officer thought the day would end like any other, a shadow appeared in the distance. He squinted his eyes, trying to make out the figure. To his surprise, it was the human again. This time, however, he wasn't alone. In his arms, the human carried an unconscious alien woman. Her body was limp, her injuries visible and severe. The human's eyes locked onto the officer's, and this time, there was no pleading, no desperation in his gaze. Only a quiet, determined look. The officer froze, unsure of what to do. The human approached the gate, his steps faltering under the weight of the woman he was carrying. He spoke, his voice shaky but filled with urgency. "Please let me in," he said, his words barely above a whisper. "She's dying. You have to help her." The officer's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the woman, and then back at the human. For the first time, he realized that the human was not here for his own sake. He wasn't asking for refuge, not for himself, but for someone else. A complete stranger. And in that moment, the officer's walls began to crumble. The human had come back, not for safety, but for a chance to save another life, and the officer had no idea what to make of it. Would he turn him away again? Or would he be forced to face the truth that maybe, just maybe, his first judgment had been wrong? The officer hesitated, his mind racing. It was the moment of truth, and everything he had believed in was about to be tested. Would he deny the human again? Or would he make a choice that could change everything? The officer stood frozen as the human approached the gate, carrying the injured alien woman in his arms. The officer had seen many things in his life, but this moment felt different. He had just turned the human away not long ago, denying him entry, and now here he was again, this time carrying a life in his hands. The human's face was grim, his eyes wide with fear and determination. The officer could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his body shook slightly from the weight of the alien woman. But it wasn't just her physical weight that seemed to weigh him down. It was the responsibility of saving her life. For a moment, the officer didn't know what to do. The human's pleas echoed in his mind. "Please let me in. She's dying. You have to help her." It was the same human who had begged earlier, only this time, it wasn't for himself, it was for someone else. Someone who needed help urgently. The officer glanced at the woman in the human's arms. She was breathing heavily, her face pale, with blood staining her clothes. She looked like she had been through a great deal, too much for someone to survive without aid. The officer felt a pang of guilt as he realized the truth. If he had let the human in earlier, perhaps this woman would not be in such a condition now. The officer quickly shook his head, trying to push the thought away. His job was simple, and he had to follow the rules. He had to keep the peace at all costs. But as he looked at the human and the woman he carried, his resolve began to falter. Something inside him was pulling at him, urging him to make a different choice. His instincts were telling him that there was more to this situation than just a simple request for entry. The human's gaze never left the officer's. His voice trembled as he repeated, "Please, I don't have much time. She won't last much longer." There was no anger, no frustration, just pure desperation. The officer could see that the human was not lying. There was no doubt in his mind now that the woman needed help, and fast. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. For a brief moment, the officer felt conflicted. He had never let his emotions cloud his judgment before, but this time was different. The human's selflessness struck a chord deep inside him. The officer had been trained to think of humans as threats, as people who would bring chaos and destruction to the peaceful world his people had built. But this human wasn't a threat. He was someone who cared enough about a stranger to risk everything, to come back to the gate that had rejected him. The officer felt a deep respect for him, but he still had his duty to uphold. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice firm but hesitant. "I can't let you in," he said. "You know the rules. No one enters without proper clearance." But as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wasn't just denying the human entry anymore. He was denying help to someone in desperate need. The officer felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He had never been in this position before, where the right choice seemed so unclear. The human, however, didn't give up. Instead of pleading more, he simply knelt down with the woman in his arms, gently placing her on the ground. His eyes were filled with an intense determination. He looked up at the officer and said, "I'm not asking for myself, I'm asking for her. Please." There was no anger in his voice, just quiet desperation and the will to save a life. The officer felt his heart race. Something deep inside him stirred, a feeling he had never experienced before. Was it compassion? Was it guilt? Or was it something else? Something that told him to act, to do what was right, even if it meant breaking the rules? He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him, but the human's unwavering gaze made it impossible for him to ignore the truth any longer. This wasn't just about following the rules. This was about saving a life. He glanced at the woman again. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven motions. She was barely holding on. The officer knew he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. As much as he wanted to stick to the rules, he knew that sometimes the rules had to be broken to do what was right. He had always followed the law, but in this moment he realized that the law could not be more important than a life. With a deep breath, the officer made his decision. He walked over to the gate control and hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the button. He looked back at the human, who was still kneeling beside the woman, his eyes full of hope. The officer could see how much the human cared, how far he was willing to go to save a life. He couldn't turn him away again. Finally, he pressed the button and the gate slowly opened. The officer stepped aside, his heart racing in his chest. The human looked up in surprise, a spark of hope in his eyes. Without a word, the officer motioned for him to enter, silently acknowledging that sometimes doing what was right meant breaking the rules. As the human picked up the woman and stepped through the gate, the officer couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice, and for the first time, he wondered if his view of humans might need to change. As the human disappeared into the distance with the woman in his arms, the officer watched them, silently praying that the human's courage and determination would be enough to save her. He had taken a risk, but he knew that sometimes risking everything for the right cause was the only way to make a difference. And in that moment, the officer knew he would never look at humans the same way again. The alien medical facility was a place of sterile white walls and advanced equipment. The moment the officer opened the gate, the human rushed through with the woman still in his arms, carrying her as though she weighed nothing, despite the visible strain on his face. He moved with an urgency that spoke volumes. It was clear he wasn't just some traveler passing through. He had something else driving him. He wasn't here for refuge. He was here for something far more important. He was here to save a life. Dex. Officer followed closely behind, still unsure of what had just happened. He had let the human in, but now, standing in the sterile halls of the medical complex, the officer began to question his decision. Was he right to break the rules? Was it his duty to uphold the law at all costs, even if it meant someone dying, because of his refusal to help? The medical staff had already been alerted, and they quickly took charge of the alien woman. Her condition was grave. She had lost a lot of blood, and her breathing was irregular. The officers and medical staff scrambled to prepare a treatment plan, but it was clear that time was running out. The human, standing off to the side, watched with intense focus, his face tense as he followed every movement of the medical team. He didn't speak, didn't demand attention. He simply waited, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The officer watched him closely, still trying to understand the situation. Humans had always been viewed as unpredictable by the aliens, known for their impulsive and often dangerous ways. Yet this human, this man, had done something different. He had risked everything to help someone he didn't even know. The officer thought back to the moment when he had first turned the human away. How easy it had been to shut the door on him, to look at him with suspicion. But now, after seeing the lengths the human had gone to, the officer felt his views shifting. Minutes passed, but to the officer they felt like hours. He kept his distance, unsure of how to act. He didn't know this human, didn't know his story or his motivations. All he knew was what he had seen so far. A man who was willing to do anything to save a life. The medical team worked efficiently, using advanced technology and techniques the officer didn't understand. Still, they couldn't seem to stabilize the woman. Her vitals continued to fluctuate, her condition growing more unstable with each passing second. The officer could see the worry etched on the human's face. He looked as though he might crumble under the pressure, but he didn't. He stayed strong, never wavering. At one point, the officer couldn't help himself. He approached the human, unsure of what to say. "You're doing everything you can," he said quietly, trying to offer reassurance, though his own words felt hollow in his mouth. The human didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his eyes glued to the woman on the table. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough, filled with raw emotion. "She's the only family I have left," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I promised her that I would protect her. I couldn't just leave her behind." The officer was taken aback by the admission. He hadn't expected that. Humans were often seen as self-serving, driven by their own needs and desires, but this human wasn't like that. He was here for someone else, someone who wasn't even his species. The officer's perception of humanity began to shift. Maybe he had been wrong all along. As the minutes passed, the officer stayed by the human's side, watching as he continued to wait anxiously, his eyes never leaving the woman. He could see the human's hands trembling, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was clear this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about the bond they shared. The officer had never seen anything like it before. There was something deeply human about the way this man cared for the alien woman, something that couldn't be ignored. The medical staff worked tirelessly, and eventually, after what seemed like an eternity, the woman's condition began to stabilize. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became more regular, and the panic in the room slowly began to subside. The officer watched as the human, exhausted and drained, finally allowed himself to relax. He sat down in a chair, his head in his hands, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up to him. For the officer, it was a turning point. He had made a decision, one that had gone against everything he had been taught. But now, watching the human care for the alien woman with such devotion, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The human had saved her. In the end, it was the human's determination, his courage, and his willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else that had made all the difference. As the officer stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he realized that this was a lesson he would never forget. Sometimes the right decision wasn't the one that followed the rules. It was the one that followed the heart. He had judged this human too quickly, had assumed that he knew what was best, but in doing so, he had nearly cost someone their life. The officer glanced at the human, who was now sitting by the woman's side, gently holding her hand. There was something different in the officer's eyes now, something he hadn't realized was there before. A deep respect, a newfound understanding of what it meant to be truly compassionate, even when the world told you otherwise. In that moment, the officer knew that he could never go back to the way things were. He would have to live with the consequences of his decision, but he would also carry with him the knowledge that sometimes breaking the rules could save a life. And sometimes the true strength of a person was not in their strength, but in their ability to care for someone else no matter the cost. As the days passed, the officer couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. The image of the human standing by the injured alien woman, his face filled with such quiet determination, stayed in his mind. It was unlike anything the officer had ever seen before. It made him think deeply about his own views, his beliefs, and how he had treated humans in the past. Humans, in his eyes, had always been reckless, selfish, and unpredictable. But this human, this man, was different. He had risked everything for a stranger, and now the woman was alive because of his actions. It made the officer question everything he had known about humans. As the human sat by the woman's side, refusing to leave, the officer found himself observing him more closely. He saw how the human gently adjusted the woman's blankets, how he kept a cool compress on her forehead to help with the fever, and how his eyes never left her face as though he was willing her to wake up. There was no arrogance, no desire for praise or recognition, just a quiet, unwavering commitment to save her. The officer couldn't help but be amazed by the depth of care the human showed. He had expected the human to be demanding, perhaps even angry about the way things had unfolded. After all, he had been turned away at the gate. But the human didn't seem angry. Instead, he seemed more focused on the woman's recovery than anything else. He hadn't come to make a point or seek revenge. He had come because he cared. The officer began to realize that he had underestimated humans. He had thought of them as nothing more than impulsive creatures, driven by their own desires. But this human, this one man, was showing him that there was far more to them than that. Days turned into a week, and the woman's condition slowly began to improve. She regained consciousness, though she was still weak. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was the human's face, his expression soft and relieved. She blinked a few times, clearly disoriented, but then a faint smile spread across her face. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The human's response was simple. "I promised you I would." It was a simple statement, but there was so much emotion behind it. The officer watched the exchange from a distance, feeling a strange pull in his chest. There was something incredibly powerful in that promise, something that went beyond just saving a life. It was about trust, about devotion, about the length someone would go to for someone they cared about. It was something the officer had never really understood until now. The woman's recovery continued, but the officer noticed something else in the human's behavior. He wasn't just here to make sure she survived. He was here to make sure she thrived. He helped with the medical staff, asking questions about the treatment plan, learning everything he could about the alien physiology so that he could assist in her care. He never seemed tired, even though it was clear that he was exhausted. He barely ate, never leaving her side for more than a few minutes at a time. The officer, meanwhile, was learning more about the human too. As he observed him, he saw a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. There was no arrogance, no need to prove anything. Instead, there was a quiet confidence in his actions, as though he was driven by something deeper. It wasn't just about saving the woman, it was about doing what was right no matter the cost. The officer couldn't help but feel respect for the human. He had seen people do incredible things in his life, but never had he seen someone so fully dedicated to another person without any expectation of reward. It was humbling. For the first time in his life, the officer felt as though he was seeing humans for what they truly were: complex, capable of great love and compassion, willing to go to extraordinary lengths for those they cared about. One afternoon, the officer found himself standing next to the human as they both watched the woman sleep. The human had been silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her. The officer could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the past few days had finally caught up to him. "You don't have to stay here," the officer said, his voice softer than usual. "She's stable now. You've done everything you can." The human shook his head, his eyes not leaving the woman. "I made a promise to her," he said quietly, "and I'm not leaving until she's better." The officer nodded slowly. There was something about the human's words that struck a chord in him. He had always been taught to prioritize duty over personal feelings, to follow the rules, to remain detached. But here, with this human, he was beginning to see the value of something else, something far more powerful than rules or laws. He was beginning to understand the strength that came from love, from loyalty, from a promise. As the days went on, the officer found himself checking in on the human and the woman more often. At first it was out of curiosity, but soon it became something more. He wanted to see how the woman was doing, but he also wanted to see how the human was doing. He had never seen someone care so much, and it made him think about his own life, about his own relationships. The officer had always kept a distance from others, too focused on his job to form connections, but now, watching the human and the woman, he felt a longing deep inside him, a longing for the kind of bond they shared. One day, the officer finally approached the human, feeling something in him shift. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady. "About humans, about you." The human looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" The officer took a deep breath. "I always thought humans were unpredictable, dangerous, but now I see you. I see what you're capable of, and I was wrong." The human smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was one of understanding. "It's not about being human," he said quietly. "It's about being there for someone when they need you." And in that moment, the officer realized that the human had taught him something he would never forget. He had learned that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in the rules or the laws. It was in the willingness to care for another person, to do whatever it takes to protect them, even if it meant breaking all the rules you thought you knew. The days passed in a strange kind of calm. The alien woman's condition slowly improved, and the human stayed by her side, unwavering in his commitment. He never left the medical facility, not for a moment, and the officer found himself growing accustomed to their quiet presence. The human continued to care for the woman as though he were her protector, not just a stranger who had saved her life. He was gentle with her, patient, and dedicated, and it was becoming impossible for the officer to ignore the bond they shared. The officer had expected the human to eventually leave once the woman was stable, but that never happened. The human remained, taking it upon himself to ensure she healed fully. There was no rush to go anywhere, no impatience. He simply stayed. And as the officer watched them, he couldn't help but feel something he had never felt before: respect. The human's devotion was beyond anything the officer had seen in his life. There was no agenda, no ulterior motive. The human wasn't seeking glory, wasn't trying to prove anything. He was simply there for the woman, ensuring she had everything she needed. The officer, in his solitude, began to question his own beliefs. Before the human had arrived, he had seen humanity as a threat, a species driven by self-interest. But now, the officer began to realize that not all humans were the same. This one human, who had been denied entry and yet returned only to save a life, had proven him wrong. The officer found himself reflecting on how quickly he had judged the human, how easily he had dismissed him as just another stranger. Now, the officer understood the depth of what the human had done and why he was staying. He wasn't a threat. He was someone who valued life, someone willing to risk everything for the well-being of another. One evening, as the officer stood outside the medical room, watching through the glass, he saw the human and the woman talking softly. The woman was still weak, but her strength was returning. She smiled at the human, and for a moment it was as though the entire world outside that room didn't matter. The officer noticed how the human's eyes softened when he looked at her, how he cared for her with such gentleness that it made the officer feel small in comparison. He had always been so focused on duty, so wrapped up in the rules and the law, that he had never truly understood what it meant to care for someone without asking for anything in return. The officer was starting to see a new side to humans, one that didn't fit the image he had always had. He had thought they were selfish, that they cared only for their own gain. But now, seeing the human with the woman, he saw something different. This human wasn't seeking fame or recognition. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was simply there, supporting someone in need, and the officer couldn't help but feel a deep respect for him. As the woman's health improved, she began to regain strength more quickly. She could sit up on her own, and soon she was able to walk around with assistance. The human was always there, offering her support, always present, always caring. The officer couldn't stop watching them. The bond between the two was undeniable. There was a quiet understanding between them, a connection that went beyond words. One day, the officer approached the human. The human was sitting beside the woman's bed, his hand resting gently on hers. He looked up as the officer approached, and for the first time, the officer saw a hint of exhaustion in his eyes. The human had been through so much, yet he still had a quiet strength about him. The officer felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude towards him, and for the first time, he spoke what had been weighing on his mind. "You've done more than anyone could ask," the officer said quietly, his voice low but sincere. "You saved her life, and you've stayed by her side when most would have left. I don't know how to thank you." The human looked at him, his expression soft but steady. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his voice calm. "I did it because I promised her. I couldn't break that promise." The officer stood there for a long moment, taking in the human's words. The simplicity of the statement struck him. A promise. That was all it took. The officer had always been taught to focus on duty, to prioritize the law, but this human, this one man, had shown him something much more powerful. A promise was more than just a word. It was a bond, a commitment that couldn't be broken, no matter the cost. And in that moment, the officer realized that he had never truly understood the depth of a promise until now. The officer had always followed orders, never questioning the rules, never straying from the path that was set for him. But now he was beginning to understand that sometimes the rules weren't enough. Sometimes the right thing to do was to break away from what was expected and do what was right, no matter how difficult it seemed. As the days went on, the woman's recovery continued at a steady pace. She was no longer the fragile figure she had been when the human first carried her into the medical facility. She was getting stronger, regaining her ability to walk on her own, and soon, the officer could see the spark of life return to her eyes. The officer was quietly proud of what they had all accomplished together. It wasn't just the medical staff or the human's determination that had saved her. It was the connection between them, the willingness to help, to risk it all for someone else. The officer found himself reflecting on what he had learned over the past few days. He had come to the border with a fixed mindset, one that saw humans as threats, as creatures to be feared. But now, after seeing the human's devotion, his selflessness, the officer knew he could never look at humanity the same way again. He had been wrong about them. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had been wrong about himself too. As the human finally stood up, stretching his tired muscles, the officer gave him a nod of approval. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," the officer said once more, "and I won't forget it." The human smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of understanding. "I didn't do it for recognition," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." And with those words, the officer knew that he had just witnessed the true power of selflessness, the kind of power that didn't need recognition or reward, but simply the desire to do what was right. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the days passed, the officer continued to observe the human and the alien woman, but now, his observations were no longer detached. Something had shifted within him. He no longer saw them as just a human and an alien. He saw them as people with stories, with emotions, with lives that mattered. The human's presence, his dedication to the woman, had begun to change the officer's outlook on everything. The human had stayed by the woman's side through her recovery. He had been there every step of the way, helping her regain strength, supporting her in every way possible. And now, after weeks of care, the woman was starting to speak more, to show signs of her former self. She was still weak, but her mind was clear, and she had begun to express her gratitude to the human for saving her life. One afternoon, as the officer stood outside the room, he overheard a conversation between the two. The human was sitting beside the bed, speaking softly to the woman. "You're getting stronger," he said with a smile. "I knew you'd make it." The woman smiled weakly in return. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice still frail. "You saved me. You didn't have to come back. For me, you could have left, but you didn't. You risked everything." The human's expression softened, and he took her hand gently. "I promised you I would protect you," he said quietly. "That promise means something to me. I couldn't just walk away." The officer felt something shift inside him as he listened to their words. He had heard humans talk about promises before, but never had he understood the weight they carried. The officer had always believed that promises were mere words, fleeting and empty. But this human, this man, had shown him that a promise could mean everything. It wasn't just a spoken agreement, it was a bond that couldn't be broken, no matter what. The human wasn't just following through on a promise for the sake of duty. He was doing it because he truly cared. As the officer stood there reflecting on what he had heard, he realized how much he had misjudged humans. He had always seen them as impulsive, unpredictable, driven by their own desires. But this human was different. He had stayed not for recognition, not for fame or glory, but simply because he had made a promise and he intended to keep it. The officer realized that he had underestimated humans in a way he hadn't even realized. There was something deep within them, a strength, a loyalty that he had never seen before. That evening, the officer made his way to the medical room, his mind racing with new thoughts. As he entered, the human looked up from the woman's bedside, his face soft but weary. The officer couldn't help but notice how much he had changed in just a few short weeks. He had gone from a stranger to someone who now seemed to hold an important place in the officer's understanding of humanity. "I wanted to thank you," the officer said, his voice hesitant. "For what you did, for staying by her side, for keeping your promise." The human looked at him with a small smile. "It wasn't about thanks," he replied. "It was about doing what was right. Sometimes, the right thing is the hardest thing to do, but it's the only thing that matters." The officer was silent for a long moment, processing his words. The human's calm, unwavering strength had finally reached the officer's heart. The officer had been trained to see the world in black and white, right and wrong, duty and rebellion. But the human had shown him that there were many shades of gray, many things that couldn't be measured by the rules. For the first time in a long while, the officer realized how little he had truly understood about the world and the people in it. The human had taught him something that no training or law could have. True strength came not from power or force, but from kindness, loyalty, and the willingness to protect those who needed it most. The officer had spent so long focusing on his duty, on what was expected of him, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. He had forgotten that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't following orders or maintaining the status quo. It was about doing what was needed, no matter the cost. As the officer stood there looking at the human, he realized that he could no longer see humanity in the same way. The human had shown him what it meant to be selfless, to be devoted to something greater than oneself. It wasn't about being perfect or following all the rules. It was about doing what you believed was right, even when it was hard. The human had proved that, and in doing so, he had earned the officer's respect. The officer finally understood that humans weren't so different from the alien people he protected. In the end, they were all capable of love, of sacrifice, and of doing what was necessary to protect the ones they cared about. The officer couldn't change the past, but he could start to see things differently from now on. And that, in itself, was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was clear now. The human hadn't just saved the woman's life. In doing so, he had also saved the officer from his own narrow understanding of the world. The officer had learned that promises weren't just words, they were a reflection of one's character, and the human's promise had changed everything, for both him and the officer. As the days went by, the officer found himself standing at a crossroads in his mind. The human had done something unimaginable. He had shown him that there was more to life than following rules and maintaining order. The officer had always thought that the law was absolute, that it was the only thing that mattered. But now, after watching the human's actions, he realized that sometimes doing what was right meant breaking the rules. The officer had seen the human's unwavering dedication to saving the alien woman, his selflessness and his strength. It made the officer question everything he had believed. The human, now a quiet presence in the medical facility, had become a symbol of something the officer had never fully understood. He had arrived a stranger, denied entry at first, but in the end it was his determination and loyalty that had saved the alien woman's life. The officer had to admit it. The human was no longer just a visitor. He had become someone who had earned the officer's respect, someone who had proven that the true strength of a person wasn't in their power or authority, but in their heart. As the officer stood there reflecting on the days that had passed, the human was sitting by the woman's side once again, holding her hand. The woman had fully recovered, her strength returning day by day. She was no longer the fragile, weak being she had been when the officer had first seen her. She was strong, alive, and filled with gratitude for the man who had saved her. The officer watched the two of them, noticing the quiet bond they shared. It was a bond of trust, of loyalty, and of love. A bond that had been formed in the most unlikely of places. The officer couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he observed them. They had gone through so much together. The human had risked his life to save her, and she had come to trust him with hers. The officer had seen many relationships in his time, but none like this. This was a relationship forged in the fire of a promise that neither of them would break no matter the cost. The officer approached them, hesitant at first. He had never been one for small talk, never been one to reach out. But something inside him told him that this was a moment he couldn't ignore. He had to speak, to say what had been on his mind for so long. "You've done something extraordinary," the officer said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. "I never thought I'd see a human capable of such selflessness." The human looked up, a tired but grateful smile on his face. "It wasn't about being extraordinary," he said quietly. "It was about doing what was right. She needed help, and I made a promise. That's all there is to it." The officer nodded slowly. He had seen many people in his life, but he had never encountered someone like this. The human had given him a lesson, one he would never forget. It wasn't about rules or authority. It was about the bond between two people, the commitment to keep a promise no matter what. The officer realized that in his life he had never made such a promise, never committed to something with such determination. It was a strange feeling, but one that he now understood. The woman, now fully awake and stronger than before, looked at the officer with a soft smile. "I will never forget what he did for me," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "He saved my life, and I owe him everything." The officer felt a lump form in his throat. The woman's words were simple, but they carried so much weight. The human had not just saved her life. He had given her a second chance, a chance to live, to love, to be something more than just a survivor. The officer had seen many people saved, but none had been saved in this way, with such devotion, with such genuine care. The human, for his part, didn't seem to care for praise. He simply looked at the woman, his face filled with quiet affection. "I'm just glad you're okay," he said softly. "That's all that matters." The officer watched them for a long moment, the realization settling in. He had been wrong about humans. He had seen them as nothing more than chaotic, unpredictable beings driven by their own needs. But now, after everything he had witnessed, he knew the truth. Humans were capable of great things. They were capable of love, of sacrifice, and of keeping promises, things that couldn't always be explained by logic or reason. It was something the officer had never understood until now. And then it hit him. Perhaps it wasn't just the human who had been changed by this experience. Perhaps the officer had been changed too. He had witnessed something that defied the rules, something that went beyond duty and authority. The officer had seen the true power of compassion, and it had made him question everything he thought he knew. He realized that sometimes the greatest strength wasn't in following the law, it was in doing what was right, in caring for others, and in making promises that mattered. The officer looked back at the human, his respect for him now deeper than ever. He had learned something important that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had learned that true strength came from the heart, not from the rules, and that sometimes the right decision wasn't always the easiest one. It was the one that came from within. As the officer left the room, he felt a strange sense of peace. The world had suddenly become a little clearer, a little less rigid. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would change how he viewed the world and the humans in it, forever. He knew that from now on, he would never look at a human the same way again, and maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest lesson of all.